you will turn in your Bibles to Esther. Somehow my marker got moved. Either that or Esther got moved in my Bible. I doubt that's what happened. 685 in my Bible. I don't know about yours. If you look at chapter 5, that's where we'll begin. So as we've walked quickly through this story over the last 2 weeks, we have seen the plot develop. Ahasuerus, the king, he dismisses Vashti as the queen because she refuses to obey him. There's a search for a new queen. Esther is the winner of the contest. She becomes the new queen. Her cousin Mordecai is one who sits at the gate. He hears of a plot against the king. He tells the king of the plot. The plot is averted, and Mordecai's name is written down in the history books. Well, then we're introduced to a man named Haman. He's elevated in the king's court to the highest position. Everyone must bow down to Haman as he approaches, and Mordecai refuses. Haman is angry at Mordecai, discovers that Mordecai is a Jew, so Haman's anger against Mordecai is transferred to all Jewish people. Haman convinces the king to put out a declaration that all of the Jews will be killed on a certain day. That day is still to come. Mordecai hears of the declaration. He makes sure that Esther hears of it. She reads it. Her heart is broken. She does not know what to do. Mordecai says, "You've got to go before the king. You have to do something." She says, "I can't go before the king because if he refuses me, then I'll die. That's just the rule. If you go before the king and he does not allow you to come, you don't just get to go back home. You're executed." So she says, I can't go before him. My life would be on the line. And Mordecai encourages her and says, "Perhaps this is the reason you've been elevated to this position. It's for such a time as this." This line that we hear so often, we even say it often in our own lives, many times misquote it or misuse it, but in this case it's not being misused. It's the way it's given to us. Mordecai says, maybe this is the reason you've been put in this position. And so her response to Mordecai is, perhaps you're right. So I will go before him. I will go before the king. I will make our case, the case of our people before the king. And she says, if I perish, I perish. And she goes from being a supporting character in the story to becoming the character in the story that God will use to bring about his plan. So before she had been commanded by Mordecai, and now she says she commands Mordecai, and he goes and does all that she's told him to do. So that brings us to chapter 5 in the story. Now we're only looking at chapter 5 today. And it's going to end awkwardly. I'm just warning you. It's going to leave us on a cliffhanger. You know, all TV shows used to do that back in the day, all the good ones. They'd leave you on a cliffhanger week after week after week so that you would come back and watch it again. Now, some TV shows that were good didn't do that, but it's because the show itself had no point, and you just watched it because of that. So you didn't need a cliffhanger to come back and watch that one, because the reason you were watching it was because it didn't have a point. So but I'm talking about dramatic shows that one would lead into the other. That's how it used to be. Now you can just watch the whole season all in one night. So all of that's been ruined by technology, I believe. So we were left on a cliffhanger last week. We're going to be left on a cliffhanger this week. The story will, though, I promise you, have some resolution, and it will have, I believe, satisfactory resolution. So if you're wondering, how's this going to go? It's going to be okay. You know, I don't want you it to keep you up tonight. But even if you didn't, believe me, it's well within your right to keep reading. It's okay. You can read the rest of the story. But I say that because chapter 5 does not give us a lot of information. It kind of sets up what's happening next, and it builds tension into the story. It's almost happens in a way that we would not have expected. Esther's plan is probably not the one you thought it would be. She does not go about it in a way that would be the first thing that comes to someone's mind. But there's a theme throughout Esther that sometimes we could miss, and it is the theme of the banquet. There's a banqueting theme throughout the book of Esther. The banquets play a key role in the development of the story. The banquets are almost like another character in the story. So the story begins at a banquet, does it not? The first banquet is the king's banquet. It's his banquet. Everything happens according to his will and his plan, and if it doesn't, you're out. So the king, it's his banquet. And in this chapter, we're going to be introduced to another banquet. In fact, 2 banquets in one chapter, and these are going to be Esther's banquets. And because they're her banquets, then the things that happen are going to be according to her plan and her will for her purposes. So the banquet itself is almost like a character in the story. Whose ever banquet it is kind of the one that's driving that part of the narrative. And so today we're going to see 2 banquets. Both of them are Esther's banquets. We'll only get to visit one of them, but we'll hear of the second one, and then we'll be left waiting to wonder what's going to happen at Esther's second banquet. And if you want to know, you can come next week, because that's where we'll be. But the banquets function on their own in the story. In the reader who reads this, especially if you read it several times, you begin to see, well, it's at these banquets where the story begins to turn. It transitions, it changes. And so I don't know what you think of banquets. Personally, I'm not one for parties. I know parties happen. I've even been to parties. I've been there as briefly as possible, actually. I know some people enjoy them, and I wonder about those people and exactly how their brains function. I just don't know how you enjoy getting in a crowd of people and like being there with them. It doesn't make sense to me necessarily. And it's not that I don't enjoy you. I do, but this isn't next week will be a banquet. Come and enjoy that. I'll be present with you. See, you got to be careful when you say these things. I enjoy people. It just, I'm not an extrovert. Extroverts are energized by people. Introverts, it's not that we hate people. It's just that we're not energized by the situation. So parties have never been my thing. But in these parties, what would happen is the people would come together to enjoy themselves. And so the banquet, you should understand, is with the intent that the people present would overindulge. I'm trying to say this as carefully as possible. At the banquet, the people that came, they would overindulge, and their overindulgence at the banquet drives them to make a decision. And the king, and it's the overindulgence, he puts aside Vashti. In this banquet, we'll see the first one is very brief. There's not much overindulgence, but it points toward one where there will be again, and then that's going to drive the story forward. And so what we find is the banquet functions, and then the function of the banquet is to point to the character of those who are present. And so when we see the king's banquet, what we discover is the king is one who has things happen to him. He just reacts to whatever happens to him. There's no intentionality to him at all. As you read the story, what you see is anybody that comes to the king and asks for something, he always gives it to them. The only one that receives the wrath of the king is the one who refuses him. But he himself never refuses anyone. The life is just happening to this king. At his banquet, he's reacting. In his life, he's reacting. So Haman comes and says, hey, this guy, he offended me. I think you should kill him and all of his people. And the king says what? Okay, sure. He's just reacting to life. Every new idea, he believes it. Every wind, every wave, it just sends him swinging one way and the other. These dramatic shifts in his behavior and decisions, and none of them are for good. None of them. Because he's completely reactive to life. And some of you sitting in this room, this is kind of how you operate. You just react. Life is happening to you. There's not much intentionality. You're not seeking to accomplish anything necessarily. You don't actually have a plan for the future, nor have you sought a plan for the future. You're just hoping to make it through today. And you're just reacting situation by situation. However it happens was kind of going to determine how your day goes. So that's what we find in the king's banquet. We have a king who just reacts to life. His banquet has no purpose. It's just a party. And whatever happens at it, he just reacts to it. What we will discover in Esther's banquet is they're the opposite. Esther's banquet is intentional and purposeful. And one leads to the other. So one banquet leads to the next in an intentional way. And the tension of the story actually builds upon these successive banquets so that we find ourselves in between them wondering what's going to happen. How is she doing this? Why? What's her plan? What's her purpose? So the difference then, as we examine the banquet of the king and Esther's banquets, we don't just see a difference in their parties. What we see is a difference in their person. Where Esther is intentional. She's not allowing life to happen to her and just reacting to it, but she is seeking God's plan and trying to live according to it in her life. She's taking the steps necessary to see that God's plan works out in submission to His will. She doesn't know how it's going to go, but she knows it won't go God's way unless she does something. And there's an impulse among us that is from the enemy that says the only role you play in God's plan is just to wait and see what happens. The only role you play in God's plan is just to pray and hope and wait. And we'll quote scriptures that say those things because we are supposed to pray and hope and wait. Sometimes we're supposed to just be still and know that He's God and He's in control. Sometimes all you can do is let go of the situation and let God work it out. There are things that are true, but that is only true of things that you could not control, that you cannot participate in. In those scenarios, you have no choice but to let go and let God. But in most things in your life, you are supposed to play an active role in working them out. And not just be a bystander, not just be a spectator to your own life, reacting to whatever happens. I don't know if any of you are college football fans, but if you are, yesterday you saw that there's a trend emerging in college football, and it began in Austin. Austin is the beginning of many negative trends, and here's another one. I don't know if you saw a few weeks ago when Texas played Georgia in Austin, the fans disagreed with the call. And the fans threw things onto the field in protest to the call, and actually the referees reversed the call. Now, obviously, they didn't say it was because of the protests and the things thrown on the field. They made up some other lame excuse. There happened to be a giant video board in their view that showed that they messed it up. That probably had something to do with it. But anyway, there was this event. It wasn't the first time that had ever happened where somebody had thrown things on the field. It was the first time I could ever remember that them throwing something on the field caused the refs, at least appeared to cause the refs to change their mind. Now, let's give some grace. The refs ended up making the right decision. They made the right call. So there's that. But fast forward to now 2 weeks later, almost every game that you watched yesterday, when the fans were upset, they threw things on the field. You saw it in Lubbock. You saw it in Tennessee. You saw it in Utah. You saw, Case. It was almost every game where it was close and something bad happened, things were thrown on the field. And so here's how this applies. I know you're wondering how this applies, other than to demonstrate I had too much time on my hands yesterday. Spectators just react to what happens on the field. That's their only role at the game. is to react to what happens. So the spectators, they see something happens, they're mad at it, they throw. I mean, if you're spectating, don't do that. That's bad. But that's what's happening all around the country, right? In these games, spectators, they see it, they react to it. They have no bearing on what actually happens in the game. They have no influence at all other than make noise. That's it. All they can do is react. And many of us live our lives spectating our own lives. We live our lives spectating what God's doing. The game is happening, whether you want it to or not. The game of your life is happening. And many of us just live as spectators of our own lives. And our only role in our own lives is just to react to everything that happens. The banquet of our lives is just us reacting to the situations that happen to us, rather than being active participants, determining players in what happens in our own lives. And what we see happen at the end of chapter 4 in Esther is she goes from being a spectator to a player. She goes from one who's having things happen to her to one who's going to make things happen. Now, I say that carefully. She does so in submission to the will of God. She does so according to the wisdom of God. She's not trying to overstep God or supersede God. She says, okay, I see God's plan, and then she asks herself, how can I participate in his plan? What does it look like for me to cease to be a spectator and begin to be a participant in God's plan for my life? And the way the author brings us to that is through the banquets. We see there's a difference in the banquets of Esther and the banquet of the king. One is reacting. The other is participating. So now we're finally to Esther 5. It's a long introduction, but I've already got us pretty far into what we're going to say. So here we go. Esther 5, verse 1. On the third day, Esther dressed in her royal clothing and stood in the inner courtyard of the palace facing it. Now, why is the third day important? She had asked for her friends to fast for 3 days. And she said, I'm going to fast too. So here, all of her friends, Mordecai and all the Jews that they know, they're all fasting. They're in sackcloth. But on the third day, the fast is not yet over. On the third day, the final day of the fast, while her friends are praying, while her friends are fasting, what are they praying and fasting for? That Esther will be able to go and make an impact. That as she goes before the king, that her life will be preserved and that the king will listen to her. So she says, I'm not going to wait till after this is over. During the fast, I'm going to go and do this. So on the third day, she dresses in her royal clothing. She goes to the place of the king. And this is the moment. I don't know if we feel the tension because we already know the end. This is the moment where she could die and the story would be over. So she goes, the outer courtyard facing the king. And the king can see the courtyard from his throne. And if he lets her come in, she lives. If he says she cannot come in, she does not only not come in, she dies. The king, it says, was sitting on his royal throne in the royal courtroom facing its entrance. As soon as the king saw Queen Esther standing in the courtyard, she gained favor in his eyes. And the king extended the gold scepter in his hand toward Esther, and she approached and touched the tip of the scepter. The first way that you can be an active participant in your own life and not simply react to what happens is to be a person who prays. Esther, having determined to go and do this act that could cost her a life, did not just say, well, we're just going to go and see what happens. She said, I'm going to pray and fast for 3 days before I do this. And I'm going to tell all my friends and family to pray and fast for me for 3 days. And during the fast, I'm going to go and do this. Notice, the only thing that changes about her is her attire. It doesn't say she ate a big meal. It doesn't say that she's in the fast. She's during the prayer. She says, I'm going to do it today on the third day. Knowing that her fate rests in this human king's hands, but ultimately her fate rests in the King of Kings' hands. how many of us suffer from prayerlessness? How many of us just go about our day without ever asking God to help us, without ever asking God for direction, without ever asking God to go before us or guard us from behind? How many of us just go, we're kind of hoping that God will work it out, but we've never talked to Him about anything that's going on? We just passively enter into our day, but then something happens that may provoke you to pray. And I don't want to denigrate that. That is how you should react if something happens in your life. But how much of our prayer is reactive and how much of it is proactive? There's nothing wrong with reacting in prayer. I'm not saying it's wrong. Please don't hear me say it's wrong. I just want to encourage you that that should not be the only reason you pray. Esther says, before I go, I'm going to pray that God would go before me so that when I go before this human king, I know that he is subject to another king. And if I'm granted favor by this king, it is because I have been granted favor by the only king of the universe. So pray before you go. Don't just react, but actively consider what is God's will for this thing. With the men, we've been doing a study on spiritual disciplines, specifically trying to look at how these apply to us as men. And one of the ones we talked about recently was prayer. And there was a quote in the book, that was a quote of a quote, and this Puritan preacher said that prayer is like a crew of a ship that throws their line to the shore to draw the boat to the shore. And he says, when they begin to pull on that line, the shore does not move, the boat moves. So that prayer does not move God to us, but it moves us to God. And the reason you pray in order to be active in your own life is to say, I want to have my will transformed into His will. Not to ask God to transform His will into yours. Look, if God ever were to transform His will into yours, that would mean that you were God. And I promise you, you do not want that. You don't want that. Our goal in praying is to ask for specific things. We know Esther was asking for favor with this human king. We're asking for specific things. But at the bottom line of every prayer is, God, not my will, but your will be done. So she goes having prayed. She's not waiting to see what will happen and then praying then. She's going in prayer to do what God's called her to do. So verse 3, it says, what is it? The king says, what is it, Queen Esther? Whatever you want, even half the kingdom will be given to you. And Esther replied, if it pleases the king, may the king and Haman come today to the banquet that I have prepared for them. And the king said, hurry and get Haman, so we can do as Esther has requested. So the king and Haman went to the banquet that Esther had prepared. The second thing we see in Esther is not only did she pray before she went, she prepared for what she wanted or what she was asking. She had worked out the next step of what would be necessary to accomplish God's will. She had thought through, practically speaking, what needed to change in her life, what needed to change in her space. What does it look like to seek God's protection for my people? In this case, that's what she's seeking. And so, look, she went to the king with the banquet already prepared. She's not reacting. Oh, the king said he'd come. Oh, call everybody. Who's bringing the turkey? Who's bringing the dressing? Who? You know? No, the banquet's ready already. She goes with the banquet having already been prepared. She's anticipating the answer from God to her request for the king's favor is going to be yes. Now, is she assuming on God? Is she presuming on God? To assume is never good. To presume on God is not good. Is she doing that? Or is she confident that she knows God's will in this situation, and therefore she's acted accordingly? I believe it's the second. It's not that she's presumed on God. She knows that God has a heart for his people and will protect them. And so a part of this way that she's going to pursue God's will for her people is this banquet. It needs to be prepared, so she prepares it before she goes to seek the king's favor. In the king, we see his character again. It's revealed throughout the story. He always says yes. He always says yes in the story. This king always says yes. He does not prove to be a very wise or strong king in the story of Esther. So he says, even as she comes in, he's enamored with her. Obviously, he loves her beauty. He says, I'll give you whatever you want. Up to half the kingdom, I'll give it to you. What do you want? And she says, all I want is for you to come to a banquet, you and Haman. So he says, hey, go tell Haman to hurry. We're going to the queen's banquet that she has already prepared. Verse 6, Baptist, just suck it up for this part. While drinking the wine, the king asks Esther, whatever you ask will be given to you. Whatever you want, even to half the kingdom, will be done. And Esther answered, this is my petition and my request. If I have found favor in the eyes of the king, and if it pleases the king to grant my petition and perform my request, may the king and Haman come to the banquet that I will prepare for them. Tomorrow I will do what the king asks. So she went in prayer. She went prepared, and then she stuck to her plan. She wasn't in a rush. She wasn't provoked by this grand offer from the king. She was not enamored with wealth or privilege that she could have easily gained in this situation. You can have up to half the kingdom. And she says, no, I'm not ready to ask you yet. It's not time yet. What I will ask is that you'll come to another banquet tomorrow. I say, why? Why didn't she just ask at the first banquet? Well, ultimately, unless you read the rest of the story, you would never know, because she does not tell, and the author does not give you a hint. Isn't it interesting? In Esther, it never tells us Esther's emotions. It doesn't ever tell us her motivations. The only one whose motivations and emotions are told to us are the enemy's motivations and emotions. We will know in just a second how Haman feels. We know what Haman feels about everything. We see his heart. We see his percolation of his plan and how he wants to be destructive. But in Esther, it never tells us. There's no hint of how she feels. There's no hint of why. It's never given to us. There is a great deal of mystery in Esther's plan, and it's not revealed. It's not revealed. And yet, what we will see is this 24-hour pause between banquets is the key to the destruction of the enemy of God. And isn't it frustrating that you don't know why? So, maybe in your life, there are things that have not happened according to your timetable, and you don't know why. And maybe you've lived a long time since that thing happened, and you still don't know why. It's possible you will take your last breath and not ever know why it went the way you did. And there's nothing to tell you. In this story, we are never told why Esther has a second banquet. Why does she wait 24 hours? It is not for us to know. What we do know is she is sticking to the plan no matter what, even if you don't know why. So is there mystery in this thing we're called to? Man, of course there is. Of course there is. There's a great deal of mystery in our following of Jesus. There are many things that happen in our lives where we never know why. And ultimately, we submit to the will of God, even when we don't know why. Trusting that He will work all things for the good of those who love Him and are called according to His purpose. Now, I don't say that verse tritely. I don't say it like it's a Band-Aid that'll fix everything, because it's not. I say it for what it actually means, even within the context of Romans 8. What does that mean? It means that many times, because God's ways are higher than ours, because His ways are better than ours, because His way is far beyond what we could ever comprehend, many times the baseline of our obedience is just to trust His way. And know that it will work out for good, not magically or coincidentally. It will work out for good because He is good. But what of Haman? Haman comes to this banquet, and he's pumped. Look what it says in verse 9. That day Haman left full of joy and in good spirits. He's pumped. He was the only one invited to the banquet besides the king. He's at a banquet with the king and queen. He's the only one there. There's not a higher honor that he could imagine. He left full of joy and in good spirits. In good spirits implies that he is not sober. There was lots of wine at the banquet. He's full of joy, he's happy, and he is a happy drunk. And as he leaves, he sees Mordecai. Look, but when Haman saw Mordecai at the king's gate, and Mordecai did not rise or tremble in fear at his presence, Haman was filled with rage toward Mordecai. Yet Haman, he controlled himself and went home. He sent for his friends and his wife Zeresh to join him, and Haman described for them his glorious wealth and his many sons. He told them all how the king had honored him and promised him in rank over the other officials of the royal staff. What's more, Haman added, Queen Esther invited no one but me to join the king at the banquet that she had prepared. I am invited again tomorrow to join her with the king. Still, none of this satisfies me, since I see Mordecai the Jew sitting at the king's gate all the time. So we pause, and we need to be prayerful. We need to be prepared. We need to trust God's plan, and we pause to say, the enemy of God is never satisfied. The enemy of God is never satisfied. There's no way you could ever ultimately please the enemy. He will always take more. He will always send you further down. He will always wish more harm for you. You cannot get low enough to satisfy the enemy, nor could you get high enough to satisfy the enemy. The enemy is never satisfied. He wants total destruction. And here we see Haman, the enemy of God, in the text as it is portrayed. He has been highly honored. He's completely self-centered. He goes to his friends and tells them all about himself. You know how wealthy I am? You know how many sons I have? Look how highly I've been honored. Look how highly I'm regarded. The enemy of God is completely self-absorbed. Self-absorption is a mark of the enemy. It is not a mark of God. Being completely self-absorbed, he says, still none of that satisfies me. Especially since there's a Jew out there who mocks me. The enemy will not be satisfied until the people of God are completely destroyed. But having seen that in the enemy, let us also see this tendency in ourselves. There's something out there that makes us think that some degree of wealth will satisfy us. There's an impulse in our being that says, if I have a good family and nothing goes wrong in my family, that will satisfy me. As we go into our occupation, our work, our vocation, something in it tempts us to say, well, if I just reach the right degree of acclaim, if I just reach the right degree of accomplishment, if I'm successful, maybe that will satisfy me. Or in society, maybe if I'm honored, respected, maybe if people could just see how valuable I am to the world, maybe that would satisfy me. And what we discover in Haman is none of that satisfies him. And I want to tell you, it will not satisfy you either. There's something very unsatisfactory about everything the world offers. So then it can never truly, ultimately satisfy us at all. It says, with all of that, Haman says, I am dissatisfied. And the thing that is the fly in the ointment for Haman is Mordecai. Mordecai, just that day, as Haman leaves full of joy and good spirits, he sees Mordecai. And this time, he doesn't want Mordecai to bow. He wants Mordecai to stand, but Mordecai does not stand. And he wants Mordecai to be fearful of him, but Mordecai is completely without fear before Haman. It drives Haman crazy. So you want to drive our enemy crazy? Then refuse to fear him. Refuse to honor him. Refuse to give him, as we've learned in our small group study, refuse to give the enemy a seat at your table. And it will drive him nuts. If there's one being in the universe that I think we ought to want to drive nuts, it's the enemy of God. There's no reason to tremble before him. There's no reason to honor him or revere him. There's no reason to give him any status at all. He has a destiny that is sealed. It is the lake of fire. And as far as I'm concerned, he could go there now. Victory over our enemy has been accomplished. There's no reason to tremble. And as you refuse to tremble before him, it leaves him unsatisfied. Isn't that great? Well, the last thing, though, is what we discover in people who make bad decisions is they have poor counselors. And so, in a negative way, we want to see the last positive thing is that would be to surround yourself with wise people. So you want to pray and you want to prepare and then you want to stick to the plan even when you don't know why. And then you want to, I don't have a P word, I stink at that, but you just want to be surrounded by wise people. What we find in Haman is he's surrounded by people like himself. His wife is the chief culprit here. Verse 14, his wife Zeresh and all his friends told him, have them build a gallows 75 feet tall. And ask the king in the morning to hang Mordecai on it. And go to the banquet with the king and enjoy yourself. And that advice pleased Haman. So he had the gallows constructed. Now this gallows, 50 cubits high, 75 feet tall, is not a place to hang from a rope. It is a place to put the person on a spike, to have their body impaled on it. Gallows in this case means a place where they would be run through and left there to decompose. And she says, make it 75 feet high. Why? So that wherever you are in the city, you could look and see. And this advice pleases Mordecai. So he has it built. Dun, dun, dun. This is the worst advice Haman could have ever received. And it's proven so very quickly. He's completely self-absorbed. He's surrounded by people who tell him what he wants to hear, who don't challenge his assumptions. They don't challenge his emotional response. They do not challenge his unwise actions. They don't challenge his hatred and how it's unfounded. He has people around him and just tell him what he wants. They're just as self-absorbed as he is, and it will lead to his death. Now, the goal of the character in the story is for us to see him as an enemy because he is, but let us not fall to the temptation of the enemy to only surround ourselves with people who tell us what we want to hear. Those who would never challenge our false beliefs, those who would never challenge our hatred or our prejudices, those who would never challenge us in ways that may not be good. If you only ever hear yes, you have not surrounded yourself with enough wise counsel. Nobody's ever right all the time. If nobody ever says you're wrong, then you are a fool surrounded by fools. The worst part is that not only do we prefer to have people around us who would always affirm us, but we believe that God would always affirm us. We believe that when we present our plan to God and our ideas to God and our emotions to God and our thoughts to God, we believe that when we do that, God is always going to say, hey, yeah, that's good. You're good. You're right. You're right to feel that way. You should be allowed to feel that way. I mean, you are right. You're good. Oh, I'm so proud of you. You're so beautiful. You're so lovely. You're so smart. You're so wise. And God just looks at us and he just admires us so much. He wishes he could be more like us. Listen, if your God never says no, then you have constructed him yourself. If your God always agrees with you, he is not actually the God of the Bible. In fact, it was never God's job to agree with us. It has always been our job to agree with him. Joshua was about to go into the promised land and lead the people. And the leader of the army of God shows up to Joshua. And ultimately, the leader of God's army tells Joshua the plan. You're going to go march around. You're going to go shout at them. Just go yell at them until they die. And it feels like that's what college was to me. Professor just yelling at me until I thought I was going to die. But anyway, it wasn't that. Yell at them until the walls fall down, so that you'll know I am the one who's fighting for you. It's not by power. It's not by might. It's by the word of God. But before he gets the plan, Joshua, he sees the commander of God's armies and he says, hey, whose side are you on? Are you on our side? Or are you on their side? And the commander of the army does not answer. And his silence is the answer. It was not the commander of the Lord's armies to be on the side of Joshua. It was Joshua's job to be on the side of the commander of the Lord's armies. God does not submit to us. We submit to him. Therefore, we never come to God and say, God, can I give you some advice? We come before God and say, God, not my will, but yours. I'm going to pray for it. I'm going to prepare for it. I'm going to stick to it even when I don't understand. I'm going to listen to people who are wise. I'm going to listen to people who will push back on me when I'm wrong. And ultimately, I will follow God even if it costs me everything. And the enemy will constantly tell you, no, it's about your wealth. It's about your family. It's about your status. It is about being honored. And all of that will leave you deeply, deeply, deeply unsatisfied. The one thing that will satisfy you is when God's will is done in your life. And it can happen to you without you knowing or doing. God can do whatever he wants, but his desire for you is that you would be an active participant in seeing God's will done in your life. So the application question is very simple. Will you? Will you go from being a spectator of your own life to an active participant? Or will you continue to just react to everything that happens to you? I mean, God can do amazing things. God can do more than you could ever ask or imagine, but he will do more in the participant than he will in the spectator, I promise you. So which will you be? Let's pray. God, thank you for your word. I pray that you would apply it to our hearts, God, that we would obey you. That it would be obvious, our obedience would be obvious, that it was your will, not ours, that this would be obvious to us and others. Help us not to be enamored by the temptations of the flesh. Help us to be single-minded, pursuing your will. And I pray that you would work that out in me. You would work that out in us as a church. I pray that in Jesus' name. Amen.